We have with us today Vivian-Lee Nyitray, who's the Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director of the University of California Education Abroad Programs. We also welcome Rick Russo, the Dean of Summer Sessions, Study Abroad and Lifelong Learning at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's also Associate Vice Chancellor of Undergraduate Education. And we also invited two students to today's event, two students who were personally affected by the outbreak of the corona crisis in Europe. First one is Trent Trombley. Trent is a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology, and he was affected by the crisis while doing research in Portugal. And we also welcome Julia Francisco to the event. Julia is an undergraduate student in molecular and cell biology, and she was affected by the crisis while enrolled in the UC Study Abroad program in Bologna in Italy. Now, before we go to our two experts in study abroad and discuss the impact of the virus on their work and how they envision the future of study abroad, I suggest we first listen to our two students. And perhaps Trent could start and then Julia could follow up. And my question to you is, please tell us a little bit more about your experience. Where were you when the outbreak started? And how did it affect your study abroad experience, Trent?
Sure. Greetings, everyone. My name is Trent Trombley. As Yaron stated, I'm a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology. I specialize in archaeology. And I was part of the 2019-2020 US Student Fulbright Research Program. So I went to Portugal in late September to carry out some of the research for my doctoral thesis, which was planned from the end of September up until the end of May. So it was going to carry for 2 academic semesters, and I would be coming home not so long ago. So when the outbreak really started to progress was in the spring, of course, and so I was studying at the University of Coimbra, which is about 100 kilometers or so north of Lisbon, the capital. And while working on some collections for my dissertation, we received announcements through our local Fulbright Commission, which works with the Bureau of Educational Affairs, that alerted us to issues going on, particularly in Italy. And I think Julia might be able to speak more about this, because what happened in Italy happened a few days prior to us, and our commission then alerted us and said, well, Portugal's fairly low in terms of the cases. I don't see any potential impact. Stay where you are, keep your head on a swivel, and things should be fine. The next day, the CDC on March 3rd, this was on March 13th, in accordance with the US State Department, labeled Europe as a level 3 travel warning. And so then the commission stated to us and urged to us that we should return home immediately, because even though Portugal itself maybe had lower amounts of cases, Europe was generally labeled as a level 3 warning. So I was in contact with a couple of my friends who were studying abroad actually in Italy, who told me that they had a lot of difficulty financially finding flights last minute, since so many flights were canceled. And so I decided it would probably be in my best interest not to stay in Portugal. And so I found the nearest flight I could and returned to the US on the 17th, some 3 or 4 days after receiving the emails. And so my research was certainly affected, but I was happy enough to have the opportunity that Fulbright and actually FLAS prior to that gave me to be able to do some of the language acquisition, cultural immersion, and research that I was able to carry out for the time that I was there. So I'm thankful, but it certainly was impacted.
Yeah, thank you so much, Trent. Let's turn to Julia. Say a few words about her experience in Bologna, Italy, right, Julia?
Yeah, so I'm Julia.
Julia, can you turn on the sound a little bit higher?
Oh, sorry. My name is Julia. I was studying abroad in Italy. Like Trent said, the warning was given in early March. It was told from us from early on, but no one really thought it was actually going to rise to a level 4. I think we arrived in Italy. But everything kind of blew up in 1 week, and we got several emails to return home. My semester was definitely affected in the sense I hadn't started classes yet. because in being in the biology department, classes start in early March. So the week that I left was the week I was supposed to start classes. And so when I came back as soon as possible, because I knew the restrictions in Italy were going to be very severe. As you guys probably know, they were on complete lockdown. And so I left within 4 days of receiving the email from the study center and from the people from UCEAP. And so I left after 4 days. I returned, I think, March 4th in California. But I did lose my entire academic semester, and I did not take classes this semester. So that's kind of how my study abroad experience went.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing this with us, Julia. Let me at this point turn to Vivian and to Rick and to ask you for a general statement on the way the outbreak affected your work in study abroad and how you see things evolving in the coming months and even years. And perhaps we could start with Vivian and then Rick could follow up. Vivian.
Sure, thank you. The first thing I'd like to say is I'm so sorry, Julia, because and we talked about this before the meeting actually started, but UCEAP had nearly 1,000 students out around the world, and all but one of our partner institutions transitioned to remote instruction, and that one was Bologna. So that is why poor Julia was completely unable to complete any coursework for the semester. And of course, the timing was pretty terrible. A couple of students managed to register for LT courses, either with a quarter campus or they actually did a cross-campus registration on a quarter campus. But because of the unit differential, that didn't really make a lot of sense for very many students at all. So it was so disappointing for her. I can hardly imagine. And it was really heartbreaking for all of us in the office because almost all of us have studied abroad or been study center directors or spent a lot of time, and we know how meaningful that experience is. And so to know that she was close but no cigar was just really really disappointing. In terms of how it affected our work overall, um, UCEAP is pretty well prepared to handle even multiple situations at the same time. So if we have a terrorist incident in one place and then there's a copycat incident someplace else, or there happens to be a natural disaster somewhere else, a hurricane or something, we can manage that. But what was a real challenge for us was the fact that this was a cascade. It was like, first it was just a dribble, the water, rising up behind the dam, and then the dam broke and it just came rushing out. And so to try to deal with all of the programs around the world and all of the students. And the thing is that every student's situation is unique. There are some things that we could say that would be general, such as, we really urge you to come home. We can do that. But if they don't come home, then we have another set of protocols and things that we can do. But when it comes to units, academic disposition, disposition of coursework, financial aid issues, each student is in fact unique. And so you can imagine the thousands of emails that were coming through, as well as calls and everything. So it's a testament, I think, to not just UCEAP and the Berkeley staff, all of the campuses, but frankly, all the study abroad staff around the world who were scrambling to deal with something that was truly unprecedented. And the collegial help that they provided, the way people stepped up, was really, really amazing and heartening. And all of that is invisible to students, and we know that, and it should be. You shouldn't see, the man behind the curtain. But in this case, people kept flinging the curtains open wide, and we had to keep scrambling. So there was significant effect. And then the decision to suspend summer programming on the heels for first the spring quarter programming and then summer programming, we realized this wasn't going to change quickly. And all of our partners abroad were quite unsure as to what they would do. And we just didn't want to have this drip, drip, drip of decisions all the time, because that put the campus staff at a disadvantage, particularly when they were now, like we were, working at home and not having the opportunity to see students face to face. We made the decision to suspend programming for the fall out of an abundance of caution, and now it seems as though it probably was the right thing to do. And what we were cognizant of was we didn't want to wait until, say, mid-August and then make a decision, because by then it would be too late for students to register on their home campuses. And we didn't want to take options away from students. So we made that decision. It has represented basically a 70% cut in our revenues. So this is quite severe. We are fortunate in that we were already poised to be able to work from home because of the fires and the planned power shutoffs. We already had made some contingency plans. So even when the lockdown came, we were able to continue working for the students pretty much without interruption. But it's been a challenge. It's a significant challenge, but I think it opens up some interesting opportunities.
Right.
And I think that going forward is what's exciting. UCEAP has only dealt in year-long or quarter, semester, or summer programs. Can we now look at ways where we might do hybrid learning, perhaps starting with online things and then transitioning to an abroad experience for a shorter period of time? Right now, can students get visas? Can students get passports? All of these are huge questions. And although, we may seem like this incredible bureaucratic organization, many of us are parents of students. I was a professor on the UCR campus for 20 plus years. And it's no exaggeration to say that we love students and we really want to do what is best, but it's a challenge in these circumstances, and we can just continue to do our best.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Vivian. Let me pass on now to Rick for some general thoughts on how your work was impacted and how you see things evolving in the near future, Rick.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. Ditto on everything Vivian said. All of our students abroad, well, most of them were abroad on EAP programs during spring. So it was really us working hand in hand with Vivian and her team to get everybody home and to safe places. And it was an amazing collaborative effort and very impressive and successful, execution. So thank you, Vivian, to you and your team for making that all happen. And then, similarly, making the decision to suspend all summer abroad programs. We're normally sending 1,000 students abroad on faculty-led programs, one that you run your own, and our global internships program, which are very, very popular all over the planet, and then EAP summer programs. Lastly, our Global Edge London, which is a program we have for newly admitted freshmen, where they normally spend their summer here on campus and then go to London and spend a fall semester studying British theater and British museums and British literature, and a really fabulous program where they are immersed in British culture and come back with a whole bunch of breadth programs completed. The moment that I made that decision to suspend it was because of a notification we received from our insurance carrier saying COVID-19 is now a known risk. And if there are medical expenses or necessary evacuations related to COVID-19, they were not going to provide coverage. And that was, as I described it, the death knell right there. How do I send freshmen to Europe and not be able to cover their expenses if they wind up in the hospital or get them home, right? So unfortunately, some of the decision making going forward, I think, has now been taken out of our hands. You know, if our partners, the insurance carriers, are saying we're not going to work with you, how can we support students in taking those risks? You know, it's never without risk. We have been dealing with crises and emergencies, tsunamis and earthquakes, and all the things that Vivian mentioned for decades. And if we're not going to have the emergency services in place, you know, it really ties our hands. However, there's one silver lining, or one real big ray of hope that I want to talk about, because I hope it has a big impact on study abroad, and a really positive one. And what we're experiencing right now, you know, being online in this seminar, all the students studying through remote and online courses, medical visits going through telemedicine. I mean, we've seen it in every different aspect of our life, that I'm describing it as the remote revolution. Like, we're experiencing it, we're living through the remote revolution. And so many of the challenges for students to go abroad are related to time and place. You know, they cannot leave their family, they cannot afford the travel. Their curriculum requires lockstep courses that are only offered face-to-face, semester after semester, right? So if there's this shift, which feels like that's happening, and a lot of it's going to stick, that the courses, these required courses, these courses on the carousel, as I've described, can be accessed remotely, then why not take your electrical circuits class, or your differential equations, or your accounting 4 class remotely, while you study French in France, you know, and while you have these immersive cultural experiences around language, culture, and whatever, you know, sort of technical subjects are available. But that carousel of courses, that time to degree, the completion of your undergraduate program is not inhibited. We have been, I call that the mountain of work we have been working on for decades with academic integration to remove those barriers, right? So if the remote revolution helps that happen, then I'm hoping that a lot of access, once students are able to get on planes and we can have insurance and all of that, that maybe many more will be able to do it, and will change the types of students who can also go, those with really technical undergraduate degree programs, or those with that, you know, family situations might prevent them from being able to travel. But as Vivian mentioned, you know, they can access some of those international education experiences remotely from here, which they haven't been able to do before. So that at least exposes them to those other students and faculty and curricula from around the world. So there's my ray of hope.
Yeah, Rick, it's wonderful to hear a silver line in all of this. And I do have a follow-up question, though, for Vivian and for Rick, before I turn to Akasemi. And perhaps going back to Vivian first. Vivian, we all know UC-EAP represents a model in the world in terms of assistance to students when it comes to study abroad. And all of this has, of course, now become more complicated. Rick mentioned the case of health insurance, costs of repatriation. So speaking also from the perspective perhaps of students who are attending this event and who may wonder, you know, how should we prepare for a study abroad experience in the future? What risks are we taking if our program is suddenly suspended? What can we do to best prepare for a study abroad experience when we think about this now? Would you have any advice to these students, Vivian? How do you see this?
I do have a few practical things. I mean, in general, of course, you want to be aware of the situation where you're going. And some practical things that you can do is to register with the State Department with their STEP program, because then they will send you alerts of things that are happening, things that you need to know. And if a situation should escalate somehow, it is the consulate that will be contacting people about repatriation flights, you know, and the availability of other services. So that's one thing that students really should do. A second thing, and this is the tough one for students, and I completely understand it, and that is buy a refundable air ticket. And of course, when you look at the price of the refundable air ticket and it's $3,000, and you look at Norwegian Air and it's $450, which one are students going to take, right? Of course, the $450 one. But the problem, which we saw over and over again, was that some of the low-cost carriers were the first to sort of close down or minimize their flights, and suddenly students were being canceled. And with a non-refundable ticket, they had no recourse sometimes. Now, sometimes the airlines made some arrangements, but quite often they did not. And the other thing is that if students are on aid, the financial aid is packaged for the price of the refundable ticket. So technically you have it, but what happens, of course, is you get this money and then you get there and you spend it on all kinds of things, or maybe your housing costs a little more and you're glad you have that money. But it's really important, I think, going forward to think about what you get for the money you're spending. For the cheap airfare, you're getting a ride there, but you're not getting a guaranteed ride back. And on the refundable ticket, you get a ride back and you get the services of the airline in helping you manage that somehow. So it's not a popular thing to say, but it is probably the single best thing that students can do. The other thing are many small things. If you have some kind of medication, make sure that you take extra. Don't just count out the tablets for the number of days you'll be there. Whatever it is, make sure you have enough and take a prescription with you. Because we did have students who ended up not being able to get back quickly enough, and then we were having to arrange emergency supplies of pharmaceuticals for them. Make sure that you have another way to get a little bit of cash, if you end up being stranded somewhere. So really kind of think ahead, be prepared, and be knowledgeable about where you're going. Get a news feed every day that provides you with updates. Or go and look at the CDC website, the Department of State website, and really, be aware and be prepared.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. Rick, any follow-up recommendations that come to your mind?
Yeah, I'd say the most important thing that a student should consider when going abroad is who are they choosing to study abroad through. If you choose an EAP program or a large, well-known, reputable study abroad organization like CIEE or IES Abroad, these organizations have gold standard emergency systems, insurance, staff, people to react and to help you in these situations, right? And the horror stories that I've heard through the spring were associated with small outfits that were belly up within days, that did not provide refunds, that really students found themselves in really difficult situations and really on their own. So it's a little like the ticket. It can often be a little more expensive to go through these large operations, but they are equipped to handle these situations. And whether it's a pandemic or it's just a personal emergency you have, as I mentioned, 30 years of this kind of stuff. I mean, sometimes it's your parent who has the emergency, or it's you personally, or it's something that's happening around you, and they all need to be handled, right? And organizations like EAP are experienced and used to and prepared to handle those situations for you. So be careful saving a buck.
My question has to do with interest in study abroad, and I'd like to direct it both to the study abroad directors and the students. So on your part, Vivian and Rick, how has student interest in study abroad been impacted by COVID? Are you still getting information requests from students? And then to Trent and to Julia, is study abroad still something that you would recommend to other undergraduates and graduate students looking to study abroad and do a similar experience to you?
I can quickly point to two things. UCEAP has record application numbers right now. It is through the roof. We have more students applying for next year than we imagined we would. by far, or have ever had in the past. So I think the interest is there. I don't know if it comes from living at home for too long now and you just need to get out somewhere, but there's real interest in it. And I think people are more globally aware and they want to get out there and see it. The second thing is that we recently did a survey of students who had been abroad in the spring or who had been planning to go this summer and didn't go. And we asked them about influencers. And it turned out that there's been a real shift. Typically, peer influence is strongest. But what this survey was showing us was that families and parents have a much larger degree of influence over students' decisions than we have ever seen before. So whether that record number of applications will turn into real applications that are completed and enrollments may depend in good part on how parents are seeing the world situation as well.
Rick, maybe a brief follow-up?
Sure, absolutely. You know, we're seeing similar data that Vivian has indicated, over 570 active applications for future study abroad programs right now, and students who were scheduled to travel abroad and go on EAP programs in fall have been asking for transfers to other semesters. So I would say absolutely the interest is there. It's just our ability to provide safe experiences that's going to see if we're able to match up those two things.
Yeah. And then maybe the students, Julia perhaps first, and then Trent.
I think I would still recommend.
Julia, we still can't hear you very well.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think I would still recommend studying abroad. I think the pandemic was definitely something no one expected, and I don't think that's a reason to discredit all study abroad programs. We got the help that we needed, and I was happy with the help that we got. So I think I would still recommend it for other students. It was fun while I was there.
Mm-hmm. Trent?
Yeah, just to echo what Julia said, I wouldn't be dissuaded in the slightest from any future potential for study abroad. I think these were kind of extenuating circumstances, I think particularly given the global scale of it. And I think I saw my commission doing the best that they could to handle the situation, and even IIE and some of these other institutes doing their best. But I think it was extenuating by virtue of the scale more than anything. And I think you always face some challenges and risks traveling abroad, but I still wouldn't be dissuaded in the slightest. So. Yeah,
thank you. I do want to come back to Vivian perhaps with a point that Rick made, the silver lining, right? This remote revolution, as Rick phrased it. So what possibilities do you perhaps, Vivian, see when it comes to study abroad online, or combining kind of a study abroad experience with an online experience, or perhaps have an entirely online experience when it comes to, for instance, doing an online internship at a foreign company or something along those lines? So Vivian, in terms of this remote revolution, what opportunities do you see there?
Well, I do think we are exploring remote internships, virtual internships. And I think that there are some fields that probably lend themselves to that pretty well. And we are exploring that, because what we don't want to do, though, is diminish the international aspect of it, in the sense that you could be having an internship with an international company, but if you're sitting at home and you're just doing some technical work for them, how is that really an international experience other than the footprint of the company? And that's what we've been wrestling with, because of course, you know, we do charge a participation fee, and I keep asking, what are the students getting for that? I mean, I want to know that they're going to get something that is unique to UCEAP. So what we are looking at developing, and there are others who have done similar things, is developing an online internship course that would accompany that and be interactive, and in fact could be kind of interesting if we had students who were doing different virtual internships in different parts of the world, and to try to talk about corporate cultures in those areas, to try to talk about you know, the things that they're not experiencing necessarily in person, but that they would need to understand were they to go there. Or in fact, some aspects of their internship could be influenced as well. So we're looking into developing those sorts of things. And then the other is a sort of a hybrid, as I mentioned. We've put in an application to Campus France, and what we are looking at is a partnership with Sciences Po, where we have UC faculty and Sciences Po faculty co-teaching an online course about issues of equity and diversity. And having this online course co-taught for students from France and the UC, and then following it up with a short-term funded experience abroad. And this is where the grant comes in to help fund that, to make study abroad for a short time possible for students who wouldn't otherwise be able to think about it. And during that time abroad, they not only meet the students they've been dealing with for the whole term, but they also can have a community engagement experience focused on issues of diversity and how they play out differently in France and in the US. So that's just one example, but I think we have a great opportunity here to be creative. And I would love to hear from the students any suggestions that you could come up with. You know, just send them to me personally. I will respond and we will talk about them and see what's possible, because you are out there, you know what you want. You know, I'm old and I'm not out there in the same way you are. So I look to you for guidance.
Well, maybe before we go back to Akasemi, maybe let me then turn to the students, to Trent and Julie, and ask if, is there anything that comes to your mind immediately at this point that you would like to pass on to Vivian and Rick? Julia, we can't hear you again.
In this specific moment, no, I don't have anything right now in mind. I don't know if Trent does, maybe.
I think I'd have to think on how, I'd have to think about it more and try to see how I could articulate it. But
let me perhaps be more specific than Trent. My question to you would be, would you engage again in a new study abroad experience, but what would be needed to win your confidence again? What would be required for you to feel confident? Okay, let's do it again. Let's go abroad. Let's study again abroad.
Sure. Yes, I would absolutely engage in study abroad again. There's no question there. I think for me, it would be interesting to see maybe some of the transparency in the contingency plans, and if any of that could be conveyed in some way. And I get that sometimes it's difficult to maybe convey the contingency plans to students, especially about the uncalculable amount of things that could happen, of course. But that was one thing I think a lot of us, both in Portugal, at least from my cohort, as well as people all over Europe, were kind of feeling in terms of ECA and some of the contingency plans didn't seem as clear as we had thought, and we were all getting mixed information from different levels of the kind of communications. And so I think had there been a little more maybe transparency in some of that upfront prior to the engagement with the program, I could see where maybe things could have been maybe more streamlined. But that's obviously a hindsight 2020 kind of thing. So I totally understand if that's not necessarily feasible. But yeah.
And perhaps Julia, any additional ideas when it comes to how to win student confidence again when it comes to study abroad?
I agree with Trent in that the contingency plans would be nice to know. In the sense also, if something did happen to this semester, what happened for the students in terms of academics and finances immediately, because it seemed, maybe because the situation it happened so fast, but it seemed that we weren't getting a lot of information, and then we're getting a lot of information from different people. So it was a little bit confusing to keep up with all the emails and the study center emails and the UCEAP emails. So and then in terms of academics, it was different for students who were coming from universities like Berkeley, who were on the semester system, and then the quarter system schools. So it was a lot of kind of trying to figure out where you went to school, how units transferred. So just knowing those kind of things and coming back to the States would have looked like, because it seemed, very confusing.
Thank you, Julia. Maybe very briefly, Rick, some comments before we turn back to Akasemi on the remote revolution, the suggestions made by Vivian, and also the comments made by the students, perhaps?
Well, I mean, there were lessons learned, right? And certainly one of the lessons learned was about clear, concise, and unified communication, right? Because it was unfolding so quickly, and because a student has an affiliation with their center, with EAP, and with Berkeley, you know, we were getting asked for updates, you know, from our executives. So we're reaching out, trying to get information from students. EAP was attempting to handle the program and wasn't necessarily focused on communicating with us. So it contributed to some of this over communication and sometimes contradictory information. And so that's a lesson that we took, is that we need to be prepared in future programs so that it's clear there's a single form of communication that is going to students, and then if it goes other places, we need to revert back to that channel. You know, it even started occurring that students would start reaching out to several places within Berkeley, and they were, you know, a question I had answered was coming to me from the chancellor's office, and like, we've already talked to that student, you know. So if the students knew you're only going to get answers from this one way, then I think everyone would have had a better experience, you know. But in hindsight, everyone was trying to do their best to communicate and to react. So in their efforts to do that, we were starting to undermine and contradict each other, you know. So that's a really important lesson that we need to keep in mind for the future.
Yeah, thank you. Let me turn back to Akasemi now for a follow-up question, Akasemi.
So now we have some questions from our audience, and the first sort of group of questions is really about differences across the regions. So if Vivian and Rick, you could say something about if there were any differences in the experiences of students, for example, that were in Asia versus in Europe. How were the students in different regions affected differently, if at all?
Rick, do you want me to speak to that?
Go ahead, yeah, because I'm thinking I don't have an answer on the tip of my tongue for that one.
There were very great differences, actually, and in a way, we were sort of prepped for the situation in Asia because we had the civil unrest in Hong Kong in the fall. So we began dealing with that, and we began thinking about suspending and then how we would make decisions about suspending going forward. Then when it moved to China and Korea, there was a huge difference in that we didn't have the ability to sort of head students off at the pass and suspend programs before they would begin and before they would leave the country. The timing of the outbreak, the timing of the lockdowns could not have been worse. There were a number of students who hold Chinese passports who had gone to China early to celebrate Lunar New Year with their family. And then when we suspended the programs and President Trump banned travel from China, these students were stuck there. You know, what was going to happen with them? So we found ourselves having to create new mechanisms whereby we would suspend a program but not suspend it. So we would suspend it for anyone who hadn't left the US yet. You were done. And that gave students, in fact, time, in most cases, to register, at least the semester students, who were the bulk of them, gave them time to register at Berkeley and Merced. The students who were there, then they kind of were in a bit of a problem because the host institutions would not take them if we didn't have an active exchange program. So we were scrambling to help them register for courses through ILTI, through online, so that they could continue to at least make satisfactory academic progress. In some cases, there was really not much that we could do for them. What evolved in Asia, we still, you know, those students in some cases are still there in China. And so we are actually directing them to be at Fudan University in Shanghai for the fall. It's working for many, but not all of the students. So there were some really significant issues that came up for holders of Chinese passports. There were one or two students in Europe who also found themselves similarly kind of locked out, not able to come, you know, quote unquote, home to the US, and then having real difficulty getting back home to China. So there were some unique circumstances there. In Korea, our partners scrambled pretty quickly and established quarantine areas for students, dormitories. Same in Japan. They were really ready and took good care of the students and allowed them to continue working online. And so we found that, and in Singapore and Hong Kong, we had suspended already, but in Singapore, we were able to manage things because the countries themselves had worked out ways of managing the pandemic. In Europe, the problem was really just the complete flood of suspensions that were needed and the number of students who were in a few places, all needing to get out, all needing assistance. Students in South America, actually, they were fine for quite a long time. They had other problems. There was civil unrest going on in Chile, so we were kind of dealing with that. There were other separate kinds of incidents, but in terms of the pandemic, they remained largely untouched for much longer. It gave us a little bit of breathing room. For the fall, we have students who have remained in Korea, in China. There probably will be some in Taiwan. We have one student remaining in Chile. And these are students who feel that it would be preferable, or they have no choice, to stay where they are. Oh, New Zealand also. So it really did impact people differentially, but I think the hardest hit in terms of having their options cut off were students who are Chinese nationals, whether they were in China or Korea, or whether they were elsewhere.
Rick, maybe a brief follow-up?
Sure. What I'm remembering being the main difference was essentially how the shelter-in-place orders came down. You could start predicting. Italy and Spain were shut down. You knew the rest of Europe was going, right, and then you knew UK and Ireland was going, right. But when the global shelter-in-place order came out, that was somewhat of a shock to the system. And we had students, for example, stuck in Peru because they weren't expecting to need to evacuate, and all of a sudden the country was shut down. And our challenge was getting them from the place they were in Peru to a city with an airport, right? And that travel was restricted. And unfortunately, the Department of State was not functioning. So we were not getting assistance from those, from the people we're supposed to be getting assistance from. And in the end, it was Ireland who evacuated the student out of Peru, right? So so I would say that's how the difference was. Like you could see it coming. It was rolling out in Asia, then it started rolling out in Europe, but then boom, whole world was really a surprise, I would say, to me.
Yeah. Now, Vivian mentioned the case of civil unrest in Hong Kong, and of course here, when we now go back to the United States, and during the Corona crisis, we've all been affected by these terrible images of the tragic murdering of George Floyd. We've seen civil unrest relating to race relations. And in the context of our discussion on study abroad, perhaps a question that we should also, I think, discuss briefly is the impact of the crisis on the future of study abroad when it comes to underrepresented groups. Because when I was listening to the recommendations that both of you were giving, think about a refundable flight, $3,000, think about a serious program, but of course those programs then are more costly. So what ideas do you have to avoid that study abroad once again becomes a privilege only of people who can financially afford that? Maybe Vivian, if you could say a few words about that first, and then Rick.
Yeah, I can. I think the affordability is one issue, and I can only speak for UCEAP. We do have our own scholarships, and we are dependent on students self-disclosing. I mean, we're prohibited from asking certain kinds of questions directly. But, our intention is to try to assist underrepresented students and to make these programs more affordable. But I think another aspect of it that came home to me when I've been traveling and meeting with students abroad is that different students experience study abroad differently. And they require a different kind of support when they're in country.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I'm really pleased that UCEAP has been doing, in fact, we had just finished the first training for our study center staff in issues of diversity and support for underrepresented students in Spain, when then we all had to run away. I actually couldn't even get on a plane to go and join them. So, but the staff had all been there and completed it, because I think it's important for them to understand the issues that students face and then have some tools and training to deal with it. So we've been working very closely with Diversity Abroad. UCEAP pays for a system-wide membership for all 9 undergraduate campuses to be members. So the staff all have access to certain kinds of tools and training and workshops and scholarships for students. The second thing, though, that I think is important is that people ask the question, why should UCEAP issue some kind of statement or be concerned about these issues? How does it affect study abroad? And it's true, it doesn't necessarily affect, buying a plane ticket or choosing which program to go on. It does to some extent, but it's not what we normally think of as the purview of study abroad. But my feeling is that students and people in general should make what is in effect a kind of consumer decision on criteria that don't necessarily have to do with whatever it is you're buying. You want to look at the company that's providing it. And so if UCEAP doesn't pay attention to those issues in-house, then I think students couldn't have confidence that they will be supported when they're abroad, or that we understand what their problems might be. And so I'm actually requiring all of the staff in our office to take UC's Managing Implicit Bias series of courses. And we have formed a diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership team. And we're going to continue to pursue ways to partner with Diversity Abroad to train our staff, make resources available to students, and just really improve on those aspects that all of us were aware of, but we didn't always pay attention to. Issuing a statement is nice, words are good, but action is better.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. Rick, maybe a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you. This has been a topic of discussion among myself and my team a lot lately, and as it should be. And the participation of Black and Hispanic and other underrepresented groups in study abroad has been a challenge as long as I have worked in study abroad, which is a very long time. And I came into study abroad around 2011 at Berkeley, when I took over that area. And we were charged with doubling the number of students going abroad at that time. I'm sorry, tripling the number of students going abroad at that time. And we have been successful in doubling it, right? And most recently, as I've been talking to my colleagues, I said, so how have we been doing? How do we compare nationally? How have we done? And I'm very pleased to say that while we've seen a doubling of the total number of students going abroad, the number of Black students going abroad has gone up by 4 times. The same thing with Hispanic students. And we've seen Asian students going at the same rate as white students, so also doubling. And the next question was, okay, so what have we been doing? How have we been affecting that change? Why are we more successful than the rest of the country in this area? And my staff talked about our partnerships with the Multicultural Center and our, the different parts of the university that work with different underrepresented groups, and our efforts around having advisors and peer advisors, so students with similar circumstances, so students who have the same skin color, or students who have the same financial challenges, students who live the same lives that these other students that we're trying to get to choose to go abroad, can mentor them and speak the same language about what their challenges are and how they overcame it and what the experience was like for them. We talk a lot about money, and absolutely financial challenges are huge, but what it's like to be a Black or Hispanic person in a certain country, that's a question that needs to be answered, that can't be answered with, we have extra scholarships for you, or we're able to help you afford it, right? So having students who have had those experiences, that have the same ethnic and demographic circumstances as the students we're trying to really encourage and give that money to and everything, has really had a very big impact. So we are forming committees ourselves to say, we want to be more intentional about this. We want there to be actual, goals weaved into the work that we're doing, so that we create programming that is also relevant to those ethnic and underrepresented groups, and also make sure that the circumstances are there that enable it for them and make them want to do it.
Thank you so much, Rick. I'll go back to Akasemi.
Yes. So now another question, couple of questions from the audience. This one referring to the recent New York Times headline about U.S. passport holders potentially being barred from entry to Europe because of the coronavirus policy response here. How flexible, in your opinion, do you think programs can be? And then also to open this up to the students, what would your ideal amount of kind of flexibility be for you as a student to be able to, for example, postpone or cancel your study abroad program?
Well, I think some of the policies that we've put in place, we would hold in place. So, for example, we're not charging withdrawal fees. There is extra work associated with it, but we are not going to hold students responsible for that. I think the flexibility, it's tough, and all of us who work in this know, that until one of us develops a crystal ball, or that enables us to see what will happen, we just don't know. We don't know any more than the students know. If we know something, we may know it 10 minutes ahead of them, maybe. And so, we're not trying to hedge our bets. I don't believe anybody is sitting there only looking at the bottom line. Let's hold out as long as possible in hopes of getting their money. I don't think that's the mindset. Because health and safety is always number one. My finance director says that all the time. That's his mantra. Health and safety, number one. And so, we're going to try to figure out what impact any decision is going to have on students, and then wait as long as we can, cognizant of those deadlines and those needs. And then we just have to kind of bite the bullet and decide we're going to do it or not do it. And there will always be people who will not be happy. We had many students who were rushing to come back. We had just as many students in some cases who wanted to stay, or whose parents were telling us, please don't make my kid come home. They're safer where they are. So, we know any decisions aren't going to please everyone, but everyone has to understand that we have no model for this. And so everything is a little bit on the fly. We can prepare, but we can't prepare 100%, and we can't forecast 100%.
Thank you, Rick.
I feel like that question is almost moot, because we're in the opposite situation where we have canceled everything and we continue to cancel everything, right? So it's flexibility. There's nothing to opt into and have flexible policies about. Really, the question is, when can we resume? Mm-hmm. And when can we do that safely? And so I'm sure we'll have some ideas about policies we should have in place then, but geez, that's the cart before the horse for sure, because we're really just hoping that we'll have something to offer at some point for students to opt into.
Any projection, Rick, on when possibly we would go back to normal? Probably there won't be a normal again, but any projections on when we could go back to a robust study abroad program?
If Vivian had that crystal ball, I'd ask her to borrow it, because it's, the way things are unfolding right now, I feel pessimistic. And when I read that article in the New York Times about the rest of the world starting to bar travels from America, first, it did not surprise me, because I said, that's got to be coming. Look at the data, right? It embarrassed me. And, you know, I think it's an issue of politics. Like the answer is get out and vote, because that's what's going to help change these outcomes.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe to the students as well, because I guess we did have a question also for the students. Maybe Trent first, and then Julia.
In terms of flexibility, it's tough. I think study abroad, at least in my experience, is best done with a lot of preparation and runway leading up to it. And I think given the severity and suddenness of all of this pandemic, it's hard to try to even be flexible, I think, in that way, to try to adjust. And I think it's been a testament to a lot of study abroad programs to, you know, and education more generally, to go digital, to go remotely. And I do kind of see some of that silver lining that Rick was speaking to in terms of remote. I think that's part of the flexibility. But I do think you still have to prepare a lot for study abroad, whether you're a student or on the other side, as part of the program. And I think given how this was so, it came out of what felt like nowhere, it's hard to really predict or plan for anything like that, I think.
Thank you. And then Julia, perhaps briefly.
I agree with Trent. I think it was, it's hard to be flexible, especially when you're working with several different programs and institutions. If anything, just having your host institution from home, being flexible with the one that you're currently at, I think that would be an important thing to understand, because they're disconnected, but it would be nice if like they could help you on both ends, because you deal with one host institution and then you come home and then there's not really much grounding to like how to deal with the situation on their side as well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Julia. And I look at the clock and I see that 1 o'clock has passed. So this is the moment for us to conclude this event. I would like to thank my colleagues, Akasemi and Julia, for co-organizing this. I would like to thank all of you in the audience for attending, for your interest, also for your interesting questions that you passed on to us. But of course, a special thank you to our guests. A big thank you to Vivian and Rick for making time, and also to both of the students, to Trent and Julia. It was wonderful to have you with us today, to learn from you. And I hope that all of this will contribute a little bit for us to be optimistic and to see back to normal as possible in the near future. So thank you all for attending. Thank you all for participating. Hope to see you at future events here at the Institute of European Studies. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.